Resources, Wednesday, August 28th. A couple of housekeeping things. Dickie is excused for today's meeting. Just a reminder, the meetings in September will be September 11th and the 25th, which are standard meetings. But for the month of October, we are going to do the 16th and the 30th instead of our regular schedule. Still doing 2, but the 16th and the 30th. So today we have 2 things on the agenda. The first one is 15-29A-B development concerns at 1505 Canterbury related to stormwater. So if I could have staff, that would be great.
Where's the city attorney that she's cruising in?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am here to talk to you about the stormwater issues that were out at 1505 Canterbury Road, and how the new draft drainage or drainage manual revisions would look at that property today to kind of contrast kind of where we are. I just want to keep a couple caveats in mind that the stormwater design manual is in draft form. We are releasing it to the public for comment during the middle of September. So this is just, so these draft manual changes are subject to change before it gets to the final form, but I just want to put that out there. But this is what it would look like based on the draft manual changes as they go today. So
Related to this case, 1505, right?
correct.
Okay, thank you.
So real quick, just to reacquaint you with the site, my colleagues at planning were able to help me draw up this very cool rendering. So this is the site. It was an natural site with no house on it at all, so it wasn't a tear down rebuild. It was a vacant parcel, and there was a house built on it. So this is what the approximate slope of the existing site was, and then the house and associated yard with retaining walls was placed on the site. This line here is actually the adjacent property line, and obviously the property line going down the back and the adjacent property line going down this side as well. So there was a occupied house here, and this is approximately where the adjacent property owner's driveway was. So essentially, this is a previous measurement of the building height prior to the building height text change. So that's what it was when the house was permitted, and then when TC 1716 went into effect, this is how the building height would have been measured if it were applicable after that.
From the original elevation point.
Correct. Correct. And if you have any more clarification on that, I'm going to defer to Travis, but
Anybody have any questions about that?
about the building height issue.
Okay.
And from the stormwater side, this is kind of what the current drainage patterns are now as far as with drainage coming off the site. This type of drainage and the design right up to the property line here, currently with the design manual changes, would not be allowed without either some sort of augmentation or further study. And I'll get into that more detail once we get into the presentation a little bit more. But this is kind of what the current drainage patterns look like with their downspouts, and there's some drainage from weep holes from like the retaining wall, and then just drainage coming off the new driveway here.
So would it have been more expensive to make that drain to the street, or it's just the way the land flows that they can't really do that?
This lot flowed so far down from the original street location, or from the existing street location, that it was an 18-foot drop, so it's been pretty tough to kind of get that back to the street. So, and just in my picture actually here, this is actually the new driveway and the existing driveway. So this is kind of what it looks like here. So that's where my picture came from on that one. So essentially, there's a lot of text, I apologize, I'll try to summarize. So with the adjustments for this particular site, with the current draft manual, there would be a lot grading plan that would be required on all new single-family dwellings, showing the existing and post-development drainage patterns, with our goal to maintain the existing drainage patterns. Any change in that flow or drainage pattern must be in an easement downstream until it reaches either stormwater infrastructure, be it a pipe, or a public infrastructure, or a jurisdictional feature, which would be like a creek or something like that. But if you're outletting to a creek, you would have to abide by all the rules to outlet stormwater to that creek. Second bullet would be a downstream assessment required of the stormwater flow rate and the velocity down until you get to such an area of the drainage area where you're less than 10% of that drainage area. So this is not just looking at the 38% maximum or 51% maximum. This is also looking at what your stormwater flow rate is doing downstream and what that velocity is doing downstream. The third bullet is all concentrated flows must outlet 10 feet inside the property line, and that includes downspouts and weep holes from retaining walls and things like that, like we saw on the graphic with that rendering. And then specifically on this site, the applicant would have been required to design and construct a swale on the downstream sides of the property, which in this case were the back property lines and the right-hand side property lines if you're looking at it from the street. And so that would have pushed them back from building right up to the property line. Unless, of course, they had some agreement with their neighbor. If they had an agreement with their neighbor, they could share that result. And one piece I did want to mention is we're currently going to require to study a little bit smaller storms, not just the 2 and 10 year, because we're seeing a lot more of these smaller storms. So we're kind of pushing that down to the 1, 2, and 10 year to kind of analyze, because we want to capture a lot of the rainfall events that we're getting.
Is that what the new manual will speak to also? 1,
Yes.
2, and 10?
Yeah, everything on this page the new manual is going to speak to.
Okay.
And so,
So in other words,
Yep.
just want to make sure I understand this. So in other words, 1505's home would not sit on the lot the way it sits today if we'd had these regulations in terms of stormwater and the text change
Correct.
about grading?
Correct.
Okay.
So just to go through a couple.
Let me
Okay.
ask one question too. Obviously this one house is not the only house that we're having problems at, and, it's probably going to be optimistically a year before any of this really, with the text changes and everything, comes into effect.
I'm hoping quicker, but yeah.
Okay, 6 months to a year. Is there anything we can do to address, all the ones that retroactively? I mean, I know that's a difficult scenario, but do we have any options for people who are suffering now and who are not going to be helped by this?
Mm-hmm. As far as beyond really the drainage assistance program, that would kind of be the only City Avenue now to
Okay.
kind of go through as far as to get city assistance or city input into that assistance.
Okay.
So at this point, outside the design manual process, that's kind of where we would be. But
Okay.
I do think as we get into this presentation, you'll see some other text changes that are coming on a faster pace. And so there might be some other things that incrementally, just like the prior text change on height and imprint. I
Yeah.
think he's going to talk about some of the repeat violator impacts, and I think those are coming on a faster time frame.
correct, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
that sort of thing, but
Madam Chair, before we, looking forward to that, but before we leave the slide,
Yes.
are we going to talk more about the second sentence in the first bullet about an easement?
Mhm.
Is that are we going to get more detail about that further in the presentation?
There must be an easement.
not really.
then.
Okay, so can we go back
Yeah,
to the
please.
first picture, the little diagram, the little isometric of the building, and
How it relates to the easement.
show me where, obviously you got a couple slides. One, the second one is, that was just a design to show you,
this is what it is today, currently.
that is what it, okay, so now, where would that easement start
So
and where would it
essentially,
end?
the easement would be on their property and then off-site,
But where would it start? It wouldn't start up near the sidewalk, is what you're saying?
not at the sidewalk. It would be the first outlet either where they built a swale or had a discharge, a concentrated flow discharge going in.
Okay, so all that sheet flow from the grading up near their driveway that wouldn't be required to be in an easement. It would just be sheet flow onto the other guy's property.
Driveway.
Correct.
And so,
So
it
do we
wouldn't matter
really-
how much they graded up their site. Whatever, as long as it was sheet flow, there would be no requirement to swale it or pipe it or anything. It would all sheet flow onto the lower property.
No, for any sort of change in fill, they would have to handle that drainage.
So
And
I thought this was
in-
all change and fill up
It
there near
is,
the drive.
yeah.
So
And this is how it's built today, so any sort of change in fill like this would take some sort of swale or something like that being constructed to handle that flow coming off that slope or grade.
But it wouldn't be in an easement. I just want to know where the easement starts, and I think I'm hearing, under the new rules, if they constructed this new elevation that changed the flow pattern, that they would be required to swale it, is what I thought I heard you say. And then my question is, okay, does that where the easement starts?
Yes, the easement would start wherever they're handling that drainage, either in a swale or any sort of pipe like that, and the easement would,
Scenario really would start at the first blue arrow up near the sidewalk. The-
But,
if that's where they started their swale, then
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yeah.
but
Well,
Russ,
wait a minute now.
but Russ, he wouldn't be able to do, he wouldn't be able to augment the grade on the site, because that's what the text change, you would measure it, then,
What I heard him say is if they adjusted the slope so that it added a new drainage pattern,
Would have an
that they would
easement.
be required to put it in a swale. And
In
then
an
the question
easement.
is, if they put it in a swale, would that not be where the easement starts?
It would, yes.
So in this diagram, if,
would be here.
since that driveway is built on a elevated grade that they created, which created then that additional slope, that spot that you're marking right there, isn't that where the swale and the easement would start?
Yes, if that's where their first instance of drainage coming off would be.
Okay, that's
yes,
what I
that would
wanted to
be-
know.
Yes.
Thanks.
And the easement would go downstream until you got to that either infrastructure
10%.
point or to that
Okay.
natural water course point.
So, but just to make sure everybody understands, but the easement is dedicated and then the city has to maintain it?
No, it's a private drainage easement. So it's still up to the underlying property owner to maintain, it just has to be
Okay.
clear of obstruction.
Gotcha.
Questions? Okay.
Now, in going to a more general standpoint, so kind of tabled up some policy concerns and kind of a policy solution kind of moving forward. And so buffers not required for drainage changes on small sites. The proposed stormwater draft manual requires swales installed to fill sections adjacent to accommodate drainage, and they would be required to be in an easement. The grading permit or erosion control plan not triggered on sites smaller than 12,000 square feet. That was an issue on the 15501 site. Since then, we've added, I say 1.5. We have a part-time inspector and a full-time inspector, and now a total 2.5 full-time inspectors are now inspecting all single-family sites less than 12,000 square feet of land disturbance. And we would be seeing this lot grading sheet on all new single-family dwellings. So it wouldn't just be triggered by a grading permit or anything like that. That wouldn't be the main trigger. We would see them all. We being stormwater, sorry.
Good.
The height of the structure measured from new grade rather than pre-existing grade, that's TC 1716, and that just revised the basis of the height measurement to the original ground elevation. Stormwater control was not required because development was under 30% of the impervious limit. As I said, the draft manual is going to require assessments downstream, looking at your impacts for velocity and for flow. And then grade changes do not require stormwater mitigation. The draft manual lot grading plans on all new single-family sites, any change in flow patterns will then require those downstream easements to connect them. So, and also something that Tansy mentioned, there's a couple text changes going on, one of which is going to be asking for public hearing soon in front of the council for NOVs and how they are handled for repeat offenders, and basically requiring them to come for land disturbance permits if they've had two or more notice of violations in a 2-year period, and they would have to apply for a land disturbance permit regardless of their disturbance. So right now they would be, if they're less than 12,000 and they have two or more NOVs in a given 2-year time frame, then they'll have to apply for a land disturbing permit with the city. So, and that was just heard at Planning Commission yesterday. And
Yeah, just a new regulation.
yeah, and then with a couple of these draft manual changes, there will be some UDO text changes packaged with those to kind of mirror them as well, to kind of beef it up. And I believe, anybody have any questions on that?
Just back to the second bullet with the inspectors now inspecting all the single-family sites, even if they're small. What happens if they, so they inspect it and they say, oh, there's a problem here, then what happens?
Then they're going through the enforcement process,
Oh,
just like
okay.
any other site.
Okay,
Yep.
all right.
And currently, checking our workload as of an hour ago, we have about 200 of these sites that we're inspecting that are single-family lots that do not have a erosion control permit. And so we have about 2.5 inspectors, and we're getting to about once every 3 weeks, we're seeing those. If there's a problem, obviously more.
Right.
Okay, so on that second one, on the policy concern side, it says sites smaller than 12,000. On the other side, it says sites less than 12,000 of land disturbance. So which is it?
Well, I think the policy concern came from the fact that people were developing sites that were even smaller than our land disturbance limit. So like the site was only 10,000 square feet, so they were able to
Would be
develop a
outside
site
of
without a land disturbance permit if they graded the whole lot. So that's kind of where that clarification came through. So I'm just stating the policy is policy solution that no matter what your lot size is, even if you're under 12,000 square feet of land disturbance, we are sending an inspector out to inspect those new single families.
And the way you know
Just better
whether
defined.
it's 12K of land disturbance or not is because they're required to submit some information that indicates what they plan to do
Correct.
before they start doing it.
Correct. And we're also checking that during the building permit review as well.
Okay.
As far as
A
the land
residential
disturbance.
building permit, they typically include information about the land disturbance?
If they're close, we usually ask them to
they're
clarify.
what?
If they're close to the 12,000
Close.
square feet, staff usually asks them to clarify what their land disturbance is.
And so it's up to them to estimate how much grading they plan to do.
Correct, but with staff oversight.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
So this is my schedule for the draft stormwater manual. Like I said, draft. Hate to keep saying that. But the survey and draft manual will be open for public comment officially starting on September 18th of this year. The first public information session, number 1, is at the Norman and Betty Camp Education Center at the Wetland Center. And that's September 17th at 6 p.m. That's more geared towards citizens because what we did with the 2 information sessions is gearing them for a citizen one and a more engineer technical one, but anyone's allowed to come to either one. We're just going to get a little more in the technical details at night number 2 and a little more on the citizen side on night number 1. So, but please, if you come out to both of them, we'll be more than happy. And the second session is at the Crowder Woodland Center, September 18th, and they both start at 6 p.m. And we're going to have a 30-day comment period open online to kind of catalog all these comments that we get from folks so we can list them up and just make our responses. And then we'll be meeting with our consultant during the month of November and hopefully present an updated manual with the comments included December, January to the Stormwater Management Commission. And that would be getting it back, hopefully a formal manual change recommended to City Council sometime in 2020, early 2020.
So I just ran into Damian Graham as I came into the building, and we were talking about surveys and public engagement and that sort of thing, and he was talking about wanting to make sure that we got, plenty of engagement on these surveys. I'm assuming you're working with his team to,
Yep.
okay, make sure that everybody knows about the surveys and the meetings.
Yep.
And,
Yeah,
okay.
we're trying to, we just got our first round of public notification out, and we're trying not to, I promised myself I wouldn't mention this, we're trying not to come out too close to the infill study, because I don't want to be confused with the infill study.
Right.
So we're trying to kind of measure the survey, but the information has been pushed out, especially to the CACs, because we want to make sure that, because their schedule actually is pretty stringent as far as how far ahead you have to get announcements on their calendars. So we
Right.
already got this information out to them. And we had, obviously, a stakeholder meeting with the Stormwater Management Commission the 1st of August. And I announced the dates to the development stakeholder group August 2nd too as well, to kind of get them to come out, so.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So I think that it might be very helpful if we could ask the Stormwater Department to reach out to the gentleman who came to the public hearing and brought his concerns at 1505 Canterbury, and to say that it has been addressed and that we appreciated him coming and making us aware of these situations, and that we've done things to mitigate those things. That would be helpful. So if there's no objection,
Is there going to be any, maybe public comment today? I see some people out who might be interested.
I will listen to any public comments as it relates to this stormwater issue. I think most of them are for other things.
Okay.
Okay, Eric, did you have a comment? I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't want to miss anyone. I think most of the rest of them are for the other item. But I would like us to just touch base with the gentleman. So if there's no objections, thus do remember that the stormwater manual has a lot more iterations to go through, and then eventually it will come back to council. So if everybody agrees, if we could push 1505 Canterbury out of the committee, do we need to push it back to the full council, or we can just?
It was
Oh,
referred to you. I think you could recommend that that it be removed from your agenda without recommending any specific action by the council, just that the council be ready to receive the stormwater manual recommendations when they come forward.
Do you think it would be helpful at all, Tansy, to have the rest of the council see the fullness of the reports? They would understand the changes that were made that address.
We could
issues.
certainly add this in terms of your committee report, the PowerPoint and the memo to the backup, so that
Let's do that, so
people
they have an
would
opportunity.
understand that.
Right,
Yeah, the clerk asked me before the meeting to make sure he got it.
okay,
Yeah, the clerk asked me before the meeting to make sure I got
okay,
all the stuff.
that would be great. So that's my motion, to push it to the
Second.
council. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Next is 1715, review of building height standards. So before we get started too far down this one, I will say that we're going to get, since we've had this for a while, we're going to get an overview of it from Travis. And Mr. Thompson asked if we could hold this open at the table for our next meeting so that he might participate in the conversation moving forward. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'll briefly go through just some background. We haven't talked about this topic in quite some time, but we have had discussions previously in this committee. You might remember this came to us through a petition of citizens back at City Council. So generally, we like to start out with our goals for our discussion. We need to decide whether or not a text change is appropriate, and if so, it would be helpful to identify the appropriate standards for consideration as we move forward. So, as I mentioned, this was brought to you by a petition of citizens, and the problem that was identified at the time was that the standards contained within the Unified Development Ordinance made it difficult to construct, Class A office space, which is generally much more gracious floor-to-floor heights, where you have taller floor-to-floor heights in a building. And so, when the City Council received that comment, the topic or the idea was referred to the Planning Commission. So there was no authorization for a text change. It was just an ask to explore potential solutions here. So we'll start with just a reminder of how the zoning code exists today. And so this is likely familiar to you. These are the height categories in the mixed-use zoning districts. And so, as is the case with any height district in the mixed-use zoning districts, we've got a maximum number of stories permitted and a corresponding measurement of feet in height. Now, when we initially proposed the Unified Development Ordinance, in its initial drafting phase, we were only looking at number of stories.
Right.
And it was through conversation, both the Planning Commission and City Council, that the corresponding feet in height measurement was added. So, as I mentioned, you're familiar with the base standards. But when you start applying the math, you see what happens to the floors. And once you get to a 7-story building, you see compression of your average floor-to-floor measurement. Obviously, you've got much more gracious area to work with in a 3-story building, a little bit less so in a 4-story building, but then really once you start looking at something above a 6-story up to a 7-story building, the floor-to-floor measurement is greatly diminished, so you're at about 12.5 feet per floor. So you might ask, well, why is that a problem? You know, the first statement we heard about this issue was, well, Class A gives us more. We typically like to see more floor area in those type of buildings. But you also need to look at this in context with other standards that we have in the code. So this chart is a comparison or consolidation of a couple of different standards. So here, you know, we've got the thing that we just looked at, number of stories, measurement of feet in height, those are your maximums. And then when you play out the math, the average floor height per floor. But then you also need to apply some other standards we have in the code about the first floor measurement. So that's a specific standard that says on your first floor you need to have a specific measurement, and that increases based on context. So there are in mixed-use buildings and certain frontages where, you know, these numbers increase. So the feeling being there that your urban form is a little bit different in certain areas of town. And then you apply that with, you know, the upper floor maximum for different building types. And what we've shown here is the difference between a general building type and a mixed-use building type. And again, if I'd stop drawing rectangles all over this thing, you'd see that we still see a ton of compression that happens at the 7-story building type. So once we received this topic, staff in the Urban Design Center did a fair amount of research, and it was actually, it was great research they performed, not only looking at our code, not only looking at what other cities in North Carolina do, but looking across the country at different codes and different development trends. So we really wanted to see, is there a significant problem that we have with our code? So this study was discussed by the Planning Commission, and they formed a very special purpose subcommittee known as the Building Height Subcommittee, and they reviewed over a series of meetings these standards and the analysis that was produced. So part of their review was looking at the 7-story zoning classification. So in all of our mixed-use districts, they looked at anything that was zoned with 7 stories adjacent to a residential zoning district. And I thought this was a great discussion point for them, because they started to see the problems that happened at 7 stories, but they wondered about the impact that might occur if you remove the measurement of feet in height at that 7-story level on residential zoning, specifically on lower density residential. So they looked at every instance where this occurred throughout the city, and through their analysis they identified that there really was not a lot of 7-story zoning directly adjacent to lower density residential, and so they had a greater level of comfort in making their recommendation to modify these taller mixed-use zoning districts. So as a result, this special subcommittee recommended that the height in feet, the measurement of height in feet at 7 stories and above is removed, so that you are left with just the number of stories in those buildings. They also recommended an increase of measurement in height for one district. Yes, ma'am.
Could you go back to that slide? I thought I heard you say 7 and above, but this just says above. So are we leaving it with 7 stories, or?
It's a great question. It's with 7 stories and above 7 stories. So remember, going back to our height categories, it would be 7, 12, 20, 40, inclusive of 7. It's a great question. So here was the subcommittee's recommendation. They recommended that first there was a change at 7 to increase from 90 feet to 102 feet. And then above that, 12, 20, and 40, no limitation. And again, their thinking being that once you get to that level, you really can't discern the increment in feet that would be increased here. So as is the case with any of our subcommittees, they were reported back to the full Planning Commission, and they had their own discussion. And so the full commission took a little bit different approach. There was the removal of any measurement of feet in height at the 7-story level, and so that would capture everything up to 40 stories. But there was also an alteration at the 4 and 5-story level. So an increase of 4 feet at 4 stories and an increase of 5 feet at 5 stories. And that largely was the product of additional discussion that happened at the Planning Commission. They received some additional feedback from interested citizens that came forward. And the results are...
What kind of feedback was that?
I'm sorry?
What kind of feedback was that?
It was just about the construction of these type of buildings, and they felt that this extra amount of height would be more comfortable to construct this Class A office space. So, wrapping up, as I mentioned, there is no text change that has been authorized. So if there is a desire to move forward, that would have to be the next step that's taken. And even though we don't have a text change authorized, we did draft an ordinance, and that was helpful for us for the Planning Commission review. So that puts us a little bit ahead from a timing perspective. And if there is a desire to move forward, that ordinance would be sent immediately to the Planning Commission for their review. And as is the case, you have options in front of you. So you can recommend changes to any of the height categories or none at all. You can look at the Planning Commission recommendation and decide which pieces to pick up and which to leave on the cutting room floor. Ultimately, there would be Planning Commission review and recommendation, and then a public hearing in front of the City Council. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions? Okay.
So the people who came to comment on this, was it largely from the development community? Were there any, people who might be concerned about these being next to residential neighborhoods?
My recollection is that it was the folks that were initially involved in the petition.
Okay. All right, thank you.
That was my question.
So for conversation, I know Mr. Whitehouse is here since he brought the petition. Joe, do you have anything you'd like to say? Just get it done? Is that heard? Any other questions? I will say to you that I sort of liked, if we go back one slide, this one was done by the subcommittee, right?
Yes, ma'am.
The fullness of understanding why we went from this to the full commission changes as it relates to anything above 7 would be helpful to know why. Because I think originally the petitioner came and talked in terms of where it started to affect the building, and it really was at the
Right.
7-story mark as the compression aspect takes into place. So it would be nice to know the fuller conversation that happened at the Planning Commission that drove them to evaluate 4 and 5.
Sure.
If you could share that with us when we bring this back.
Yes, ma'am.
That might give us it would give me a better sense of why. It might be something very quite recent why I just don't know it, so it would be helpful to know that.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to know that as well, because I do have some concerns, as these are placed next to residential neighborhoods. It just would be nice to understand the rationale.
Sure.
So I'll just repeat the comment that I've made every time we've taken this up, and that is I prefer to just eliminate the entire measurement in feet column. The only time I've ever seen that measurement invoked was in a scenario where a person wanted to build 5, but they came in and said, but we're going to keep it at the 62 feet height cap of 4 stories, so that's why you should give us 5. And it always became sort of a gaming the system that really didn't, in my mind, add value. So I'm still
And you're
there.
still sticking with that, right?
Yeah, and actually, as we performed
there's-
our peer city
there's good
research,
in
we
that.
found that the city of Raleigh is unique in that it captures number of stories and feet in height. And I don't believe we could find any other city in our peer city research that did that. Most either regulated only stories or stories and floor area ratio, but never with a combination of feet and height.
So
Yeah.
I'll take one more step into the history of this. And
Okay, go for it.
originally, the idea was, well, what if people have other ways of gaming the system by building multiple mezzanines? And so they would be able to go a lot taller, but only count the stories that excluded the mezzanine occupancy. And since then, we've changed the code, so you only
Right.
get one mezzanine.
Right, so
I
we
think it's
we
only on the
addressed
ground
that.
floor.
Yes.
So all the reasons, in my mind, for doing the measurement in feet in the first place have gone away, and only thing that's left is the gamesmanship. So,
Well, and I don't know whether this contributes to gamesmanship or not, but from a layperson's point of view, I think feet, especially at the 3, 4, and 5-story level, is useful. It's kind of like, how tall is a story? How long is a piece of string? I mean, you kind of, if I know that something's going to be 50 feet tall, I can kind of visualize that. If I know it's 3 stories, but there's nothing that controls how many feet that is, then I have trouble visualizing it and understanding what it's going to be like next to my neighborhood. So I think for a layperson, it's useful to get that up to a certain point.
Mr. Cox?
I have no comment right now.
I sort of lean in with Russ on that. I'm not sure that we need both measurements, but a fuller discussion will be had by the entire Growth and Natural Resources Committee to sort of ferret out some of those thoughts.
I mean, I can say, I mean, I am in agreement. When you're 7 and above, we can do away with the feet. So I am in agreement with that. It's below 7, particularly 3, 4, 5. I mean, those are the ones that you'll see typically near residential areas, and those are the ones I need to think about some more.
Anybody wish to speak today? Because this will stay open for our next meeting. So is there anyone here who wishes to speak? I got some land use attorneys sitting out. You mean they don't want to say anything?
okay, so now, can I offer one comment back in the other direction?
Yes, you may.
And that is, I don't ever expect to see a 3-story building with a mezzanine, but
Oh.
the 50-foot number would limit a person's ability to do a 3-story building with a mezzanine. And if that's what you want to limit, then that's the way to do it. So.
Thank you for that insight, Mr. Stevenson. If there's no other questions, and we're going to leave this open for further discussion with Mr. Thompson when he returns at our next meeting, then if there's no other questions, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. So thank you all.